Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 77. The Language Awakens. We continue our journey back through the landscape we have traveled together. In previous parts of our recap, we laid the foundation, how we moved from seeing the universe as a collection of separate phenomena to understanding that it speaks one language, Phi, the Holophase. Now we dive deeper into the heart of Episode 7, where something extraordinary happened. We did not only learn about the language anymore, we began to see with it. The symbols stopped being abstract marks and started to act as lenses. The grammar rules stopped being lines in a notebook and started to describe the living world around us. It was like moving from studying French in a textbook to walking through a busy street in Paris, suddenly realizing that you understand what people are saying. This is where phi stopped being a purely mathematical concept and started becoming a way of seeing. In this part of the recap, I will walk you back through how the language awakened, how you moved from memorizing definitions to actually hearing the universe speaking in the language of phase and its derivatives. We will go slowly. You have come far, and your mind is carrying a lot. So let us breathe, remember, and retrace the key steps of Episode 7, where the language came alive. We begin with a distinction that changed everything. In the first part of Episode 7, we realized that we had to be very clear about the difference between a code and a language. A code, like Morse code, is a fixed lookup table. One pattern stands for another. Dot dash dot means the letter S. Dash 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 means the letter O. The code itself does not grow. It does not surprise you. It simply translates symbols into other symbols according to fixed rules. DNA is also like a code at one level. A fixed set of letters, A, C, G, and T, maps into amino acids and structures through biochemical machinery. A language is different. A language like English or Pashto can say things that have never been said before. With a small alphabet and a small set of rules, you can form an unbounded number of meaningful sentences. You can write jokes, poems, theories, prayers, insults, and lullabies. You can speak to a child, to a scientist, to a stranger, or to your future self. A language is not just a lookup table. It is a generative engine for meaning. In Episode 7, we saw that phi is not a code in the limited sense. Phi is a full language. Phi, together with its derivatives, is a generative system. The master tree of derivatives is not a static catalog. It is a living grammar. From that grammar, reality can form galaxies, atoms, storms, ecosystems, neural patterns, and thoughts. Each of these is a sentence or a paragraph written in the same underlying language. We return to the master tree to see it with new eyes. Before, it looked like a complicated diagram, a branching structure of symbols with arrows between them. In Episode 7, we began to feel it as a living tree. Think of a great tree in winter. You see it as bare branches, an outline against the sky. That is like seeing the derivatives of phi as a list. Then spring comes, and suddenly the same branches carry leaves, birds, nests, insects, fruit, and flowing sap. The geometry did not change, but the life in it did. That is what happened to the master tree for us. It went from skeleton to living organism. Every branch of that tree, every derivative, stopped being just a symbol on the page and became a way of expressing meaning. Omega was no longer just angular frequency. It became the local feeling and pacing of time. Kappa was no longer just a wave vector. It became the texture of space. The total change d phi was no longer a formal differential. It became the unified motion of reality through time and space together. Velocity v stopped being a number attached to a particle and became the story of how a pattern moves in order to follow a phase crest. This shift from dead code to living language was the true beginning of Episode 7. You started to develop semantic ears, not just mathematical eyes. You started to ask not only what is the formula, but what is the meaning of this letter in the story of reality. In parts 4 to 8 of Episode 7, we took the first order derivatives. omega, kappa, d phi, and v, and gave them semantic depth. Before, we had learned their definitions. Now, we asked what they actually mean in the narrative of reality. Omega, the time derivative of phi, is the rate at which the local phase clock is turning. Mathematically, it is the derivative of phi with respect to time. But in the language perspective, omega is temporal character. A high omega region is a fast ticking region. Many cycles happen in a short duration. A low omega region is a slow ticking region. Fewer cycles happen in the same duration. You can feel this in everyday life. The flicker of a fluorescent light has a certain omega. The heartbeat has another. The slow swing of a pendulum clock has another. Near a massive object, like a black hole, the gravitational field changes the local ticking rate, and time itself is dilated. If you tune your mind to omega, you are asking, what is the local tempo of reality here? In episode 7, we gave many examples. Hummingbird wings versus eagle wings. Fast electronic circuits versus slow tectonic plates. Omega became not just a parameter in equations, but a way to classify and feel the pace of events. Kappa, the spatial derivative of phi, tells us how quickly phi changes as we move through space. Again, it is easy to treat this as a dry mathematical object, just a gradient. But in the awakened language view, kappa is spatial meaning. It describes texture, pattern, and structural detail. The stripes on a zebra have one kind of kappa distribution. The rings of Saturn have another. The ripples in a sand dune or in a desert wind have others. When the magnitude of kappa is large, space is finely structured. There are rapid changes over small distances. You get sharp edges, tight waves, intricate patterns. When kappa is small, space is gentle and broad. Patterns change slowly over longer distances. You get smooth fields, soft gradients, expansive shapes. Learning to see kappa in the world is like learning to recognize handwriting. You start to feel the difference between fine script, block letters, cursive, and rough scratches. They are all phases of ink on paper, but their kappa patterns are different. Velocity v took on a new meaning as propagation meaning. Normally, velocity is introduced as distance per unit time. It seems like a basic concept on its own. In the Holophase language, v is not fundamental, it is derived. In simple wave situations, v is the ratio between omega and the magnitude of kappa. In other words, how fast the phase is changing in time divided by how fast it is changing in space. This ratio determines how fast a crest moves in space. That insight makes v a child of omega and kappa. Motion is born from the relationship between temporal rhythm and spatial texture. When we say that v is propagation meaning, we mean that it is the way reality expresses how quickly a pattern, a disturbance, or a message moves through the medium. A surfer matching the speed of the wave, a sound pulse moving through air, a bright spot of light crawling across a screen, all are examples of v in action. Each is a way the phi language says, this pattern travels like this. The unified change d-phi became our bridge between time, space, and motion. D-phi is what you get when you move both in time and in space. It tells you the total change of phi along a general path. In episode 7, we emphasized that omega and kappa are not separate existences, but different directional slices of d-phi. When you move purely in time, you see omega. When you move purely in space, you see kappa. In reality, we almost always move in mixed directions, so d-phi is the more natural object. By leaning into d-phi, we took a step toward relativistic thinking, without writing any of the usual formulas of relativity. We started to think not in terms of an absolute grid of time and space, but in terms of the total change along paths in the phase field. That is another aspect of the language awakening. You stop treating the coordinates as the primary thing and start treating the change of phi as the primary thing. After deepening the first order derivatives, we turn to the second order layer, the adjectives and adverbs of the language. We asked how the basic rates of change themselves evolve. This brought us alpha, the second time derivative of phi, curvature g, the spatial second derivative, and mixed second derivatives that connect time and space together. Alpha describes how omega changes over time. If omega is the tempo, alpha is the tempo of the tempo. In music, a constant beat feels steady. A beat that accelerates toward a climax or slows toward an ending feels different. In motion, alpha is what you feel as acceleration. In episode 7, we connected alpha to the felt sense of time speeding up or slowing down in different circumstances. We also touched, in an intuitive way, on how alpha appears in cosmology, where the expansion of the universe can accelerate or decelerate, giving different stories for cosmic history. Curvature G tells you how the slope of phi changes in space. If kappa is the slope, curvature is the bending of the slope. A flat region has zero curvature. Every step feels the same. A ball has positive curvature. The slope increases as you move toward the center. A saddle has mixed curvature. The slope increases one way and decreases another. In the holophase picture, curvature is not a side effect, it is central. Paths of least action, the trajectories that particles follow, and the bending of light around mass, all can be understood as responses to curvature in the phase landscape. We also studied convergence and divergence through the divergence of kappa. When a field of kappa vectors points inwards, patterns are converging. When they point outwards, patterns are diverging. This language allowed us to describe focusing of light, gathering of flows, or spreading of diffusion in one unified way. Again, this was not just mathematics. It was a semantic tool. Convergence means intensifying meaning in a region. Divergence means diluting it. Mixed second derivatives gave us the first clear picture of how time and space are interwoven in the dynamics of phi. They quantify how the temporal change depends on where you are and how the spatial pattern depends on when you look. We used simple physical images, like moving weather fronts or waves approaching a shore, to help you feel what it means for time and space derivatives to talk to each other. Then we lifted our eyes from the lower floors of the master tree and looked upward into the infinite towers of higher order derivatives. We met jerk, the third time derivative, which measures how acceleration changes, and gave examples from riding in vehicles where uneven acceleration makes you feel jerk in your body. We named higher levels like snap and crackle as reminders that the hierarchy can continue as far as needed. The key lesson, however, was that we rarely need all these levels in practice. Higher derivatives exist and matter, but much of the essential structure of the world is already captured by the first and second order layers. The infinite tower is there as a conceptual guarantee, showing that the language has no artificial ceiling. Yet, for actual understanding, we can often stop after a few steps. This is part of the wisdom of working with the holophase language, knowing how much of the tower you need to describe a situation without drowning in unnecessary detail. In the later parts of episode 7, we returned to topology with a more mature understanding. We revisited winding numbers, the integers that measure how many full turns the phase makes around the defect. We deepened our grasp of how continuous fields can give rise to discrete charges, and how the sigma set of defects can be thought of as a discrete skeleton inside a continuous body. We saw how braids and links of defect lines can encode complex, robust patterns that recall the behavior of particle families and field configurations. We also spent time with waves as carriers of meaning, discussing dispersion relations as grammar rules linking omega and kappa, and distinguishing between phase velocity and group velocity as two different notions of speed. We saw wave packets as phrases in the language of phi, localized bundles of oscillation that carry information and energy in a coherent way from one place to another. We discussed interference as the meeting of meanings, where two patterns do not simply pass through each other, but combine, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes canceling, sometimes creating rich new structures. By the end of episode 7, after all these explorations, something quiet but profound had happened in you as a listener. You were no longer hearing these symbols as foreign. Omega, kappa, d phi, v, alpha, curvature, convergence, mixed derivatives, topology, dispersion, group velocity, interference. These no longer sounded like pieces of an intimidating code. They had become familiar voices in a language that you could begin to follow. You started to look at everyday scenes and spontaneously translate them into holophase terms. A stone dropped into a pond became a story about kappa patterns expanding, omega rhythms radiating outward, V describing the speed of ripples, and interference patterns where waves meet. A city at night, with its flickering lights and moving traffic, became a complex tapestry of temporal cadences, spatial textures, and motion fields, all describable as derivatives of a single underlying phase. This is what I mean when I say the language awakened. It awakened in your perception. It awakened in your intuition. You did not just know the definitions, you began to see with them. That is the true turning point in any language journey. It is the moment when you no longer mentally translate from your mother tongue, but simply understand directly in the new language. In this second part of our recap, we have walked back through that awakening. We remembered the shift from code to language, from skeleton to living tree. We revisited how omega, kappa, d phi, and v gained semantic depth. We recalled how second-order derivatives introduced nuance, quality, and curvature. We reviewed how higher derivatives form infinite towers that guarantee completeness, and how topology and waves provide the digital core and communication channels of the language. In part 3 of this recap, we will go even deeper. We will explore how all of this came together into genuine literacy, how you learn to think in holophase, how dimensional echoes and identity over time began to make sense, and how the entire master tree turned from a technical diagram into a map of meaning for existence itself. For now, let this all settle. You have come very far. You are no longer an outside observer of reality. You are becoming a reader of reality's native language. Before we close this part, I want to slow down even more and walk through a few concrete scenes from ordinary life, translating them into the language you now know. This will help deepen the shift from abstract knowledge to lived intuition. Imagine you're standing at the shore of the sea, watching waves roll in. At first glance, you might simply see water heaving up and down. But with your holophase eyes, you can now ask different questions. What is the omega here? Some waves are gentle and slow, others are choppy and fast. That difference is a difference in temporal rhythm, a difference in how quickly the phase of the surface water is cycling. You are listening to variations in omega. Next, you look at the spacing between wave crests. Sometimes they are far apart, sometimes they are tightly packed. This is kappa, the spatial derivative, telling you how quickly the phase repeats across distance. Big, slow swells have small kappa. Short, sharp ripples have large kappa. Already, just by looking, you are reading omega and kappa from the scene. Now follow a single crest as it moves toward the shore. How fast does it advance? That is V, the propagation meaning. And you know now that V is not an extra independent ingredient. It comes from the relationship between the temporal and spatial rhythms. Where the water is deeper, the dispersion relation between omega and kappa is different than where the water is shallow, so the speed of the crest changes. You are watching the grammar rules of that medium act on the basic letters to produce a particular motion. If two sets of waves cross each other, perhaps from a boat passing or from waves reflected from rocks, you see interference patterns, regions where crests and troughs meet. Some regions become especially high, others become unusually flat. With holophase language, you describe this simply. The phase contributions add up. Where they add in step, you get constructive interference. Where they add out of step, you get destructive interference. The scene that once looked like messy surface motion has become an intelligible text, written in a small number of letters and rules. Take another example, this time from light. Imagine shining a laser pointer at a double slit and watching the bright and dark bands on the wall behind it. In old explanations, you might have memorized that light is a wave, and that waves can interfere. In holophase language, you have a much cleaner picture. You think of the phase of the electromagnetic field, of its omega and kappa, and of how the paths through the two slits produce different phase accumulations. At the screen, the total phase difference decides whether the local contribution is bright or dark. The stripes are a direct image of phase relationships. You are not thinking in vague metaphors, you are literally reading an interference text. Or shift to something as human as a crowded street crossing. People are walking in different directions, some fast, some slow, some weaving, some waiting. With holophase intuition, you can think of the crowd as a field of motion, with velocities v assigned to each person. You can see regions where flows converge and diverge, where there is shear as layers of people move past each other, where local accelerations, the alphas of their motion, are high, as people suddenly start or stop. If you like, you can imagine that there is an underlying phase field organizing these patterns. But even without that visual, your language of derivatives gives you a crisp way to describe what is happening. Why does all of this matter? Because when you can describe something clearly, you can think about it clearly. One of the deepest gifts of Episode 7 was that it gave you a single, unified description space for phenomena that otherwise feel unrelated. Waves on the sea, light in an experiment, crowds in a city, traffic on a motorway, air in a storm, brain activity in a scan, all can be seen as patterns in the phase language, structured by omega, kappa, v, and their higher derivatives. This unification is not just elegant, it is cognitively powerful. It means you can carry one compact mental toolkit and apply it everywhere. Another powerful shift that happened in Episode 7 was your relationship to scale. Early in our journey, it might have seemed as if you needed different concepts for the quantum scale, the human scale, and the cosmic scale. The language of holophase dissolves that illusion. At every scale, what matters are rhythms, textures, motions, curvatures, and topological structures. The size changes, the units change, the relevant frequencies and wavelengths change, but the underlying alphabet does not. Omega at the quantum scale, kappa in a crystal lattice, v in a galaxy rotation, alpha in cosmic expansion, curvature in spacetime, they are all manifestations of the same derivative ideas. Episode 7 helped you feel this. We spoke of galaxies as vast sentences, of atoms as tiny but intricate glyphs, of biological systems as living paragraphs, and of minds as whole books written in nested oscillatory patterns. This is not poetry for its own sake. It is a literal redescription of physics and existence through a single universal language. The metaphors are ways of helping your intuition catch up with what the equations are already telling you. Falsifiability also took on a sharper meaning in this awakened phase of our journey. We insisted again and again that holophase is not allowed to be a vague philosophy that can never be wrong. It must be a precise language that can fail. Episode 7 made that demand concrete. For any phenomenon we describe, we must be able to identify which derivatives of phi are active, how omega and kappa behave, what the relevant curvatures and constraints are, how topology and waves contribute, and how all of that fits into the triunity of time, space, and motion. If we cannot do this, the holophase story for that phenomenon is incomplete at best or wrong at worst. You may remember moments in Episode 7 where we tested the language against tricky cases. We asked how it handles forces, how it handles the coexistence of continuous fields and discrete particles, how it handles information flow and causality. Each time, we try to see whether there is a clean and honest way to say, this is what phi is doing here. This is how its derivatives are structured. And this is why the observed behavior follows. The more such tests the language survives, the more seriously it deserves to be taken. The more cases where it struggles, the more it must be refined or abandoned. This is the spirit of science, now applied to a language-level description of reality. It is also important to recognize how Episode 7 deepened your sense of dimensional unity. Earlier, we introduced the idea that every derivative of phi has temporal, spatial, and kinematic echoes. In Episode 7, we practiced that idea until it became second nature. Whenever we met a new symbol, we asked, what is its time phase, its space phase, its motion phase? Omega is obviously temporal, but it also appears in motion as part of velocity and in space through dispersion. Kappa is obviously spatial, but it affects how motion happens and how temporal patterns look when you move through them. V lives in motion, but is inheriting its properties from omega and kappa. Curvature can be seen as a spatial property, but it shapes temporal evolutions and motion paths. This constant three-sided reading trained you to stop thinking of time, space, and motion as independent domains. Instead, you began to see them as three projections of one underlying activity. In part 3 of the recap, we will formalize this further as the dimensional echo principle. For now, it is enough to notice that you have already been using it. Every time you thought of a phenomenon as one single thing that is showing itself in temporal, spatial, and kinematic ways, you were living inside dimensional unity. Salam, and peace be upon you. Always remember this.